Good evening. I'm Darnell Hunt, Dean of Social Sciences at UCLA and Professor of Sociology and African American Studies. Thanks for joining us here today for this important conversation, protecting the right to vote in the 2020 election. So, we're about 2 weeks out from what many have described as the most important elections of our generation. Today, we will discuss what we know about the need to protect the right to vote in 2020. Fortunately, I'm joined by a panel eminently qualified to frame this conversation. First, we have Matt Barreto. Matt Barreto is professor of political science and Chicano studies at UCLA and the co-founder of the research and polling firm Latino Decisions. Time magazine called Latino Decisions the gold standard in Latino American polling. And The Guardian wrote that Latino Decisions is the leading Latino political opinion research group in the United States. Matt Barreto received his Ph.D. in political science from UC Irvine in 2005 and was on the faculty at the University of Washington for 10 years before joining us here at UCLA in 2015. Next up, we have Lorrie Frasure. Lorrie Frasure is an associate professor of political science and African American studies, and she's currently the acting director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA. Since 2008, she has served as the co-principal investigator of the collaborative multiracial post-election survey, the first multiracial, ethnic, multilingual post-election study of political preferences and behavior among registered voters in the United States. She received her PhD and MA in political science from the University of Maryland, College Park, a master in public policy from the University of Chicago, and a BA in political science from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Next, we have Natalie Masuoka. Professor Masuoka is chair of the Department of Asian American Studies and associate professor of political science. Her research interests include racial and ethnic politics, immigration, political behavior, and public opinion. Her most recent book, Multiracial Identity and Racial Politics in the United States, explores the rise of Americans who self-identify as mixed race or multiracial and the impact on politics. This book was recognized as the best book in political behavior by the Race, Ethnicity, and Politics section of the American Political Science Association. Professor Masuoka received her PhD and MA from University of California, Irvine, and a BA from Cal State University, Long Beach. Before joining UCLA, she taught at Tufts University and Duke University. And last but certainly not least, we have Chad Dunn, a nationally known civil and voting rights attorney. He is the co-founder and co-director of the UCLA Voting Rights Project. As lead counsel, Chad handles the UCLA Voting Rights Project's pending cases. Chad is an expert on voting rights, election law, reapportionment, and redistricting. He has litigated and tried numerous federal and state election cases around the county. Along with Matt Barreto, Chad teaches and directs UCLA Voting Rights Project students in a yearly multidisciplinary course and clinic that includes law students, public policy students, and students of social sciences. As many of the UCLA Voting Rights Project students, Dunn has co-authored many reports that focus on expanding access to voting, such as protecting democracy, implementing equal and safe access to the ballot box during a global pandemic. So, of course, the notion of protecting the right to vote suggests that this right might somehow be in jeopardy, an idea that seems inconsistent with our ideals of American democracy. The New York Times published a revealing expose a few weeks ago entitled "The Attack on Voting in the 2020 Elections." According to this piece, current efforts to suppress the vote, quote, have their roots in Reconstruction era efforts to suppress the votes of newly freed slaves and came roaring back to life after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. They are nothing short of decades-long disinformation campaign, sloppy, cynical, and brazen, but often quite effective, carried out by a consistent cast of characters with a consistent storyline. The piece concludes, quote, the movement to convince the country that voter fraud is a present danger to the democracy has itself become a present danger to democracy. So my first question is for the panel. Place the current moment in historical perspective. How do some of the strategies currently being deployed to suppress the vote compared to what has been done in the past? And why don't we start with Chad, since he's sort of leading the Voting Rights Project on this. Chad?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for including me. And it's an honor to be here with these panelists. Uh, the struggle of voting rights has always been a two-step forward, one-step back exercise. And of course, it's been true that over the history, people by force were denied the right to vote. People were harassed, they lost their jobs, their families, their vocations were harassed, and in many cases, people were murdered for doing so. So it is fair to say with confidence, we're in a lot better place today as Americans than we have been in the past. That doesn't make this moment any less alarming than it has been in the last few days. In fact, we received a decision today out of the influential Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans saying that the right to vote, although grounded in the Constitution, is not what's called a liberty interest and therefore is not protected under the 14th Amendment due process and equal protection clause. Now, to a lot of us, that seems shocking. And without getting too much into the legal detail, that means that the law now in Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi is that the government can take away your right to vote and you don't have a claim for equal protection or even a claim to get a hearing about why your right to vote was taken away from you. It's quite shocking and outside the normative of legal opinion up till now. But for folks who want to know a little bit more about it, go back and read any random Justice Harlan dissent from the 1960s in any voting case. Just Google it, Justin Harlan voting dissent. The Reynolds v. Sims is a great one to start with. That philosophy that was the dissent in that opinion is that there is not a federal right to vote and that it shouldn't be protected by federal courts, that instead the relationship is between a state legislature and the federal government, not between voters and their federal government. And you will get a sense from that as to where our country is headed, at least through the federal courts and the new judges that have been installed on what it finds to be the right to vote. So it's going to be absolutely critical in the days ahead and the months and years for Congress and legislatures to reassert themselves and recommit to the right to vote. We can no longer expect, as we had been able to do in many cases since the 1960s with the courts.
Very, very interesting. I mean, much is at stake here. So, Matt, can you talk a little bit about your perspective as someone who's been heading Latino decisions and some of the issues that Chad has brought up?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Dean Hunt, for organizing this. It's going to be a more timely time for this discussion. As Chad just mentioned, we're getting rulings almost every day, and they're just generally across the board not in our favor, those of us who support the expansion of voting rights and equal access to the ballot. In the Latino community, what we're seeing is a rollback or limitation of Spanish language access, as well as the ability to have language assistance at the polls. There have been efforts to harass and intimidate voters. We're seeing this every day now, and the courts have not been clear. To Chad's point, the courts have not been clear on what is and is not allowed. And so we're seeing in high density Latino parts of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and the Southwest, reports of voter intimidation in Mexican-American neighborhoods, of trucks coming and with people with firearms and law enforcement. And so right now, the right to vote is under attack, and there is a lot of nervousness about this. But what we are also seeing right now to date is that over 27 million people have already voted in this election. Yeah. And so we are seeing a response. And I think this is an interesting thing, and maybe a scholarly research thing to kick around, is while there is both a attempt to intimidate or suppress, people are responding right now with renewed interest. And that's very exciting to see. And we're seeing very high rates across communities of color so far in this early voting.
I want to come back to that actually, but I want to give Natalie and Lorrie a chance to kind of weigh in on the first question. But this whole idea of voter engagement, the fact that we're seeing historic turnout levels in the middle of a pandemic is quite telling in terms of people's resolve to do something. But let me turn to Lorrie now and have her talk a little bit about the survey that she is the co-principal investigator on and some of the takeaways from that.
Sure. I'm really happy to be with you today, and it's an honor to have worked with so many scholars on this panel for work we're doing on voting rights. And one of the things I wanted to note was that In this year, I wanted to echo some of the points that Matt made with regards to the Latino population, because we're seeing that in the research that we're doing among African Americans as well. This commemorates the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so we all worry about the extent to which grassroots organizing, get out the vote, the GOTV kinds of forms of voter mobilization among African Americans may be impacted by modes of intimidation. For example, Souls to the Polls this Sunday marked the first Sunday of early voting, and Souls to the Polls has been something that's been so consequential to Black voter turnout, and we know that places that have experienced large buses of voters going in their Sunday's best to the polls is something that's been important to the Black experience. And how will that be impacted by the pandemic? As Matt noted, among Latinos, we also see that for Black voters, they are very, very highly engaged in the political process now. But on the other hand, Black voters are more likely, as compared to other groups surveyed, to feel that their vote will be suppressed, particularly when it comes to the mail-in ballots. And they also are more likely than other groups to feel that there could be trouble at the polls. So while many African Americans are, for the first time, utilizing absentee ballots, we know that this practice is not really cultivated in the same way that we imagine participating in the political process as African Americans. For African Americans, it is something traditional and symbolic to stand online, pack that backpack with the lunch, bring the kids along for the whole experience, right? And bring the lawn chair and make it a family affair. Well, now, if you're concerned with the distrust, right, of mailing in your ballot, because you know that on average in many states, it's more likely to be rejected than other groups. And then at the same time, you fear, because of the safety of the elders and your loved ones, about the extent to which they will experience sickness as a result of going out to the polls. So again, while African Americans are highly engaged in the political process, more likely to feel that their vote may be suppressed or they could be intimidated, they're still coming out in droves because of the consequential nature of this election.
And of course, some of those fears that you were alluding to about mail-in ballots not being counted seem to be warranted in terms of what we've heard about coming out of North Carolina and a few other places. So it's a real concern. Natalie, can you talk to us about your research and what you're seeing in other communities with respect to this particular election and engagement and some of the concerns that people may have?
Yeah, you know, I think what's really important to note, and it's really nice to follow Lorrie's historic description of African Americans, is that in many ways for Asian American voters, that they have a different story, right? This is the most immigrant group, minority group in the United States. Over 70% of adults in the Asian American community are immigrants. And so these are new Americans and new voters. They don't necessarily have this population, our population doesn't necessarily have a long-standing history of seeing trustworthy and equitable voting procedures, right? This is, for a lot of folks, this is their very first election voting. And so we, look at this as really a problematic example for new voters about what it's like to participate in American democracy, right? Asian American voters increased by 30% between 12 and 16, the 12 and 16 presidential elections. I'm sure for various different types of districts and areas, Asian Americans really are part of that demographic change and the voting electorate change of districts. And I can see that in some ways that's alarming. And so the flip side would be, right, is demonstrating and intimidating our new Americans and preventing them to cast the ballot. And I think that this is really an ongoing concern. Another concern that we have, of course, is making sure, because this is a largely immigrant population, that there is access both in English and as well as in the various different Asian languages. Of course, one of the things here is that legally we can provide languages when a group constitutes a large enough proportion, right? Usually, and that number is usually 5%. But I think some of the mismatch here is that for those populations that are the smallest, are usually and don't necessarily make it to that 5% threshold. Those are often our populations that are most marginalized. They have least connection to the community. They need the most support, particularly in terms of language access to election materials and to knowledge about where to register to vote. And so these are some real concerns. And providing accurate and trustworthy translation is a big part of the struggle this year.
Yeah, lots of challenges for sure. I mean, fortunately, we happen to be located in the state in California where at least the apparatus is in place to maximize the number of people who can vote. That said, it doesn't sort of insulate us from attempts to even suppress people here in California from voting. We've heard about instances of various types of shenanigans that are in place with, unofficial ballot boxes and this, that, and the other. So who knows what else may be around the corner. So on that note, I wanted to kind of follow up on a point that Lorrie made. You talked about this being the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. So in light of the situation that we're facing now, and I wanted to kind of get your respective takes on this, talk to me about the Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act in 2013 and how the current Senate's failure to act on a House bill to restore key enforcement mechanisms may play out. Anyone? Do you want to?
Chad may be a good one to start with that, Darnell, because he was actually there that day in the courthouse, I think, in Shelby County versus Holder.
I got to tell you, so I happened to be in the Supreme Court chamber when that case was argued, and then also when the decision was handed down. And the courtroom was full of America's civil rights greats, giants, John Lewis, on through members of Congress. It was quite a sight to behold. And the way these opinions are announced, the clerk announces Justice so-and-so has the opinion of the court in the case of. And so in this case, it was Chief Justice John Roberts had the opinion in Shelby County versus Holder. And you looked over and you saw Justice Kagan and Justice Ginsburg. It looked to me weeping, and heads in the chambers went down. It had an immediate disastrous impact, and it is continuing to have a disastrous impact on the right to vote for racial minorities in the United States. And I'll give just a few examples. When I walked out of the courthouse, they don't allow you to take a telephone into the U.S. Supreme Court. So you have to check it in lockers. And so I took my phone out, I turned it on, and instantly there was a tweet from then Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott saying the voter ID law that Texas had passed, that we had stopped under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in a trial that we had in D.C. Over the course of 4 weeks. We had gotten an order that the law was racially discriminatory and stopped it. We had this tweet from Governor Abbott saying it's immediately into effect. And there was a voting taking place right then on a number of school district and city elections. So they went from not having voter ID that morning to literally requiring voters to show voter ID that afternoon. Now, knock on wood, we luckily filed another lawsuit later that went to the Supreme Court 3 times under a different part of the Voting Rights Act and was able to stop the voter ID law in Texas, but a myriad of other changes have gone into effect.
Yeah, can I interrupt just 1 second? Sure. For those who don't quite understand, what is it about requiring a voter ID that effectively suppresses the vote, particularly for underrepresented groups?
And I should be more precise, requiring a photo voter ID. Every state requires you, and has for decades, to identify yourself in some way. And oftentimes that's an affirmation, an under oath statement that's subject to criminal penalty, showing some document. Oftentimes it could be a piece of mail you received, banking records, all sorts of things. What Texas did is it sat down and it picked 5 different types of IDs, and they determined in advance that those IDs were held disproportionately by Anglo voters in the state, and chose those and specifically rejected allowing IDs that were held at higher rates by racial minorities, including IDs that were issued by the government. IDs issued by the Department of Public Safety, the same agency that issues driver's license in the state, also were not allowed to be used. School IDs, bus pass IDs, all kinds of other photo voter IDs. What's wrong with these laws is that they're made to sound to be fair, but they're designed in their application to be racially discriminatory in their enforcement. The IDs selected, the process that you go through, all of these things are designed very carefully to subtly, but importantly, suppress the vote in various places. So as I mentioned, in the voter ID context, we were successful in stopping that from taking effect even after part of the Voting Rights Act was struck down in Shelby County. But I would like to And there's a myriad of examples that that were stopped under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act that are not been cured today. I'll give you one. The city of Beaumont, Texas, which is about 45% African American, its school district there is about 55% African American students when I last looked at it 3 or 4 years ago. That school district was not integrated until the 1980s by federal court order. 1980s, I didn't misspeak. That school district was finally desegregated. And the school board finally was taken over or elected a majority of African American preferred candidates in the early 1990s. As a result of that provision of the Voting Rights Act being gone, a state court essentially ordered at-large elections in Beaumont, and a majority white school board was installed. So a school district that has a majority black voting population, has a majority black student population, is now again controlled by whites, and for a variety of factors, it will stay that way. And counties all throughout, they're in Shelby County, Alabama, one of the litigants in that important case, Galveston, Texas, Pinellas County, Florida. There were sheriff and JP and constable districts that had elected African American and Latino candidates of choice that were immediately eliminated by white leadership in the county, so that no longer can those citizens, have a meaningful opportunity to elect. A myriad of laws went into effect statewide in places. Texas passed laws making it easier to purge voters. North Carolina passed an omnibus statute that the Fourth Circuit, when it ruled on it, said with almost surgical precision, attacked the voting rights of African Americans. So the list goes on and on.
Yeah.
And the burden now is on the civil rights community, the voting rights community, to bring lawsuits using the remaining tools. And then the burden is also on experts like these and others at the School of Social Sciences and other universities to bring to bear the evidence, the social science research that proves this particular voting method, in fact, harms these segments of society. And so the burden's now shifted to us, whereas before, under the Voting Rights Act, these sort of measures were automatically stopped. So, I liken it to the city's on fire, and there's only a handful of fire hoses now. And everybody's doing what they can, but it's a dire situation.
I will say, if I could jump in quickly, Darnell, I think getting to some federal legislation is where we're going to have to go. And that's going to have to be, as Chad just mentioned, based on research and social science and evidence. But we cannot rely on the existing structure that we have right now, meaning the Voting Rights Act from 1965. We can't rely on that. The courts have weakened it, and it is time for a Voting Rights Act for the 21st century. Right. And so that should be at the top of the list. I think if you look around what has happened in 2020, that should be at the top of the list of a new Congress, regardless of who those new members of the Senate and House are. Yeah. A fundamentally new approach to equal and equitable voting access.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't HR 1 when the new House came in? Didn't they have a number of provisions in that bill to kind of protect the vote and democracy? That was about funding of campaigns and that type of thing.
It did. The HR 1 was a really good start. It was a really good start.
It kind of died in the Senate. It never went anywhere.
It never got through. And again, this died over partisan politics. It used to be that voting rights was a much more universally accepted thing. When the Voting Rights Act was renewed historically, it was often renewed on 90% or in some cases 100% consensus, and renewing it for another 5, 10, 25 years. Most recently in 2006, the version that got struck down was renewed by overwhelming Republican and Democratic support. But now you have HR 1, that bill stopped. So we're going to have to rebuild that. We're going to have to start with HR 1, but make it better, go further. Now that we see what they're doing this year, we're going to need to let the legislature come in and say, no, there is a fundamental right to vote. And every state cannot have their own different laws. There needs to be a national standard that everyone has a right to vote, and to vote in these different ways, much of the way that we do in California. So I hope that's at the top of the list. And I hope that some of the research that we're all doing, can inform the ways that this new Voting Rights Act will move forward.
Natalie and Lorrie, I want to make sure you guys get in and take a bite of this apple. Any thoughts you have about sort of the legacy of the Voting Rights Act and sort of the jeopardy that we face today, given the weakening of that act?
Well, striking down of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act just further confuses new entrants into the electoral process. trying to figure out if you are in a state that requires an ID and which kind of identification that you should have. So when Matt notes that there should be some universality with regards to these differences among states, these public policies that are placed upon us as an electorate oftentimes impacts negatively and disproportionately those who are most vulnerable: minorities, low income, elderly voters, those who are in rural areas, right? And so again, simultaneously, while we wait for politics to play a role, and politicians to figure it out, what are we going to do on the ground for rural communities, Black and Brown communities, poor communities, to make sure that they are mobilized? And again, when folks ask me what can we do in the next 2 weeks, if you are not further mobilizing your neighbors, whether that's Zoom or text and other kinds of mediums, or if you are doing a little bit of canvassing on your own in your community, in your neighborhood, we cannot take our eye off the ball, because vote choice is not the same thing as voter turnout, right? And though African Americans vote over 90% for the Democratic Party, that doesn't mean that they will show up and show out. It means that they vote over 90% for a particular party, but that doesn't mean that without mobilization, right, towards the ballot box that is persistent up until election day, that we can anticipate that they will turn out. Because oftentimes voters can sort of get complacent and say that, you know, look at the surge in early voting, look at the surge in what's going on with the long lines, and they decide to sit this one out. And none of us who believe in American democracy can afford to sit this one out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Natalie, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'll close by really also just trying to raise some questions about what Shelby County v. Holder really did ask us to do. And unfortunately, what we're living through in this moment, which was part of the decision in Shelby County, was the idea here that we have become so racially progressive that we no longer needed institutions or laws like the Voting Rights Act, that they weren't needed, right? That we are now so post-racial, we're past our racist moments, right? From what, what they recounted in the early 20th century through the 1950s and 60s. And that was part of what the justices had declared, right? With their decision in Shelby County. And so what we're now being asked to determine and also to fight for is how important, and if these institutions do not exist, right, we cannot truly have progress on racial equity and inclusion in this country. So I think the other thing that we really want to think about is really our orientation to the importance, right, of institutions, but also some of the dangers I think that we culturally have been witnessing with this idea that we are now past race, we're no longer a racist country, and how that feeds into some of these arguments that we're seeing even at the Supreme Court level, right? That then restricts really major important policies that have made real change in this country.
Well, it's really interesting. The events of the last few months would seem to kind of demolish that idea that we're beyond race. I mean, clearly. There are racial tensions. There, I guess, the specter of white supremacy, of white supremacists, different groups, has sort of, risen to the top of the agenda in ways that we really haven't seen in a long time. But Natalie, I just want to follow up with you. I'm, kind of following up on this basic point. So at the start of the coronavirus pandemic, we saw a terrible increase in xenophobia and anti-Asian comments, including by our own political leaders. So what do we know about how this has impacted voting attitudes in the AAPI community?
Yeah, so on the one hand, we have all of these voting rights access cases, and then the other thing that's happened for 2020, right, is that we are now witnessing a lot of the hardships associated with coronavirus and how that might also impact voting access for November. One of the things, unfortunately, that we'd witnessed with the coronavirus was the increase of anti-China rhetoric, not only heard from the presidential administration, but also globally. And what unfortunately happened is that starts to bleed into an anti-Asian American, right, or the scapegoating of Asian Americans as the people identified as holding or bringing the coronavirus into the United States. Unfortunately, what we saw was a rise of anti-Asian violence, anti-Asian attacks, and a general anti-Asian sentiment that we saw in this country. One of the interesting things that I've been working on with a graduate student is we had it was a little bit at a fortunate happenstance. We had a panel, we've done a panel study where we had Asian Americans who we had interviewed. My graduate student Vivian Leung had interviewed in February. We recontacted them in May, asking them, kind of various things that happened over the course of the coronavirus. One of our initial or early analysis is showing, however, is that while Asian Americans have been very aware and they've reported anti-Asian bias waged against them, what we are finding, however, is that there does seem to be a mobilizing effect that, like Matt had pointed out, and Lorrie, that the consequences at stake here are now very personal for a lot of communities, and so they're recognizing, right, the importance of their vote, the impact of their vote, and we are seeing, we actually can measure some of this in some of the studies that have been participating in on Asian Americans.
Yeah. So Lorrie, we'd already touched on this a bit. You've talked about how African Americans are one of the most reliable Democratic voting groups. Black women in particular, in many ways, are like the core of the Democratic Party. We're already seeing reports, as we mentioned earlier, that Black voters in North Carolina are facing higher rejection rates of their absentee ballots. And in Georgia, we're seeing reports of lines as long as 7 hours in the Black community. You had mentioned how some of these suppression techniques were maybe leading Black voters to question whether their vote was going to ultimately count, whether they should actually participate or possibly sit out, all of that exacerbated by a pandemic. What does your gut tell you? What do your data tell you about the likelihood that voter engagement, when it really gets down to the ballots that are counted, will be higher this go round than they were, say, in 2016 when the efforts obviously worked?
Well, a couple of things here to point out. Black voter turnout rates declined for the first time in 20 years in 2016. They declined by about 7 percentage points. And so many of the political pundits and other analysts sort of look to say, look for some of the reasons why Black voter turnout may have declined from the Obama years to 2016. But we think that a fairer assessment is to compare Black voter turnout rates, not from 2012 to 2016, but the extent to which Black voter turnout rates, they returned back to pre-Obama. They returned back to the numbers of 2004. And so they actually began to stabilize in a way that, of course, during the time of a Black man on the ticket, the first African-American male on the ticket, to really boost African-American voter turnout. And so now we're looking at, again, a very consequential election, and we're looking at a conundrum for Black voters. On the one hand, they are consistently over 90% Democrat, with African-American female voters leading the Democratic Party in many ways, often called the stalwart of the party, often called the backbone of the Democratic Party, and also stepping up to say that they demand more of the Democratic Party, which leads to Kamala Harris on the ticket, and so many Black women and Black women organizations fighting for decades for voice and for a seat at the table. So on the one hand, you see this highly engaged electorate, particularly among African-American women voters who have a long time relationship to the party and pushing for change. But again, you see these recent studies and policy reports that suggest that this mode, because of the pandemic, this mode of voting, that is not something that African-Americans have been it's not a part of the African-American voting experience to have with the mail-in ballots. And so many folks overall are, if they're submitting a mail-in ballot, are more likely to be rejected than in-person ballots. But this has a disproportionate effect on first-time voters and minority voters. So you're looking at a large surge in 18 to 29-year-olds, right? As well as minority voters during this time who may be likely to have their ballots rejected. So most folks are saying, look, if you plan on choosing this mode of voting, vote early, mail in your ballot right away, meaning today, right? If that ballot is on your kitchen table or in the kitchen counter, mail it in today so you can figure out or understand the extent to which it's going to count. You can follow up, right? And so we are sort of, pushing this. I hope in this setting, how important it is to vote early, and to, if you plan on mailing in your ballot, to do so as soon as possible. The other quick thing I just wanted to say about your question is the role of distrust. Oftentimes it's a dual-edged sword for African Americans. This isn't anything new, as Chad has pointed out. We've long battled voter suppression. But one of the exciting things about someone who studies Black politics or the American political process is, like Nat and Natalie, is this a window to sort of learn more about communities of color? Data using from the 1960s and 70s showed that these kind of suppressive techniques actually increased a sense of Black group consciousness and consciousness among other minority voters. That when you account for things that matter, like socioeconomic status, that when you compare African Americans and white voters and put them on the same level playing field, when you account for their socioeconomic status, and they are now the same, that those early studies using data from the 1970s and 80s show that African Americans are more likely to turn out to vote at higher levels than whites once you account for factors that matter across the board, like education and income. So scholars have tried to, for 30 or 40 years, understand why. And many of them point to the role of consciousness, sort of a coming into understanding that their vote and thereby their role in the American political process is now discounted or suppressed, and that pushed them to the polls, that pushed them, that despite their income or education or their predicament being disproportionately affected by the pandemic, that they came out. So we have historical and empirical evidence that early modes of disenfranchisement, early modes of voter suppression, it served to increase voter turnout among the least of these, among African-American voters. And so we are watching very closely about the extent to which distrust and suppression and sort of feeling disaffected can actually have a mobilizing effect in 2020.
Yeah, it should be really interesting to follow that. So Matt, I wanted to follow up on a point I think you made a little bit earlier. You had some research that looked at ballot drop boxes and voter intimidation of Black and Latino voters in Pennsylvania. And I understand that you wrote an expert opinion for a case there. Can you talk a little bit about that case and the outcome?
Yeah, thanks. And I think the Trump administration has appealed that to the Supreme Court, and we may be hearing back any day now on whether that stands. But that was called Trump versus Bookvar, the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, they were using ballot drop boxes, similar to what we have here in California, as a way to deposit your absentee ballot. And they also had a law in Pennsylvania that people from within the county could come and be poll observers, but you could not be outside of the county or out of state. And
of course, just to kind of jump in for a second, the ballot boxes everywhere is sort of a response to the fact that people were concerned the post office, because of what had happened there, couldn't handle the volume of ballots.
Exactly. And in fact, the Postmaster General had sent out a note to all state secretaries of state informing them that there could be delays in mail delivery. And the post office actually told secretaries of state, this note came in about July, said, please consider allowing ballots to be received after Election Day because we cannot guarantee them. So this was sending alarm bells. Many states responded positively by saying, let's help you by putting out ballot drop box locations, places that are official. They're controlled by the county government. You can put your ballot there. It will come directly to us. And so the Trump campaign, in this case, sued Pennsylvania over this, saying that these were not trustworthy, that these were a way to have voter fraud. And so we did research on that, and we found that in the state of Pennsylvania, we conducted a survey and we offered an expert report in that case through the center that Chad and I lead the Voting Rights Project here. We found that Black and Latino voters in Pennsylvania were more likely, just right to Lorrie's point, more likely to distrust the mail, and they liked having this option to directly deliver their ballot. It more closely resembled the in-person voting experience. And we found that those groups, in particular in Philadelphia, where there's a very large Black and Hispanic population now, would be disproportionately impacted by the removal of these drop boxes. And so ultimately the judge ruled in our favor. We had a very strong ruling saying that no, Pennsylvania was right to allow these drop boxes, that they are a part of the way to vote. And as I said, currently that case is on appeal, but as of now, they're being used. And we're really excited to be a part of that case and offer that research.
Great. So Chad, I'm going to put you on the spot. So we've heard now in passing any number of different techniques that have been used over the years to suppress the vote and the ones that are currently in operation. Can you kind of give me your top 5 in terms of the ones that you think, based on your experiences, are having the biggest impact and what we can do about it, particularly given the fact that we're a little bit more than 2 weeks out and things that we may still be able to do to make a difference in the remaining days ahead?
Well, so lawyers and folks that focus on voting rights law look at vote suppression in 2 different ways. We have what you call vote dilution techniques and vote denial techniques. Mm-hmm. And although right now, and I'm going to give some examples here in a moment, although right now vote denial is much back in vogue, I'll still say the number one vote suppression technique in the United States of America is vote dilution. That is the drawing of political districts in such a way to ensure the outcome. And I think voters of color in particular, immigrant Americans in particular, suffer day to day because the districts they're drawn in won't honor their vote nearly no matter how they turn out.
This is how we get Republican majority legislatures in a lot of states, when if you actually look at the population, it should be different. It then impacts, the way the voting laws are set in those states often, and it becomes like this vicious cycle.
It does, and with the computers that we have today, and a lot of the techniques that social scientists like the 3 on this panel have developed can be used by political actors, unfortunately now, to drill down and draw districts that produce the result they want all the way until the next census. And we're about to unfold that process here with even fewer tools than we've ever had since the 1960s to protect against discrimination. As we mentioned, we've lost pre-clearance, part of the Voting Rights Act that was very helpful on vote dilution cases. And now we've also lost arguments, thanks to a case at the Supreme Court last year, about whether or not partisan redistricting can be allowed. And that has racially discriminatory effects because the parties are so racially polarized in their vote, at least in a lot of places, especially throughout the historical South. So number 1 on my list is vote dilution. On the vote denial devices, frankly, when I got started in this work about 20 years ago, nobody did vote denial cases. You would meet with the elders, right? That trained us and taught us our skills, and you would hear their stories about their vote denial fights that they would have in court back in the 50s and 60s. And it was at that point, thankfully, history. Unfortunately, vote denial is back with a vengeance. I think the first place has everything to do with registration. That's the number 1 place to engage in vote denial. That doesn't include just voter purges, which we have mixed success at repairing at the courthouse. We had some success in Texas on one of Natalie's points. The state was very concerned about the growth in the Asian American population in Texas. And so it engaged in a voter purge of essentially people that had gone and gotten a driver's license at some point in the state and had said they weren't citizens. All those people were attempted to be purged from the voter rolls without regard to how long ago they went and got their driver's license. So a lot of these folks went and got a driver's license and said, I'm not a citizen, but they later got naturalized. Turns out it was about 98,000 of them. And the state tried to purge those folks, and a court stopped them. But there are lots of purges in lots of places. There's one, unfortunately, going on in Florida at this moment that stops the gates to the voting booth. And then the other things I think are more subtle. I mean, frankly, fortunately, we ought to all agree that, it's no longer legal to stand in front of a polling location with a government fire hose scaring off people from voting, because that was, once a vote denial technique. But the methods used now, as I mentioned, are much, more subtle, but in some cases more effective, because they're not just a single polling location technique, they're a statewide technique. And so some of those we saw one today. I'll give you an example. It's at the forefront of my mind. The state attorney general in Texas is making a big to-do about how election workers cannot be made to wear masks as a way to advertise to the community it's dangerous to go vote, especially in a state where the folks that have suffered the most from COVID-19 are the Black and Latino population. So, the sky's the limit in your imagination if you are willing to engage in vote denial techniques. But then the other sort of tried and true things are voter registration denials. We're seeing more and more states invoking a voter registration process that starts to look a lot like a literacy test. It's some kind of quiz or dodge or hustle where you've got to get just a perfect amount of things right, and that gets you registered. And all too often, the people reviewing the voter registration applications have some sense of the applicant's race or ethnicity. So those are the big ones at this moment. And of course, COVID-19 was an opportunity for vote suppressors around the country, and they've used that, as I mentioned, with masks and a hold back on mail voting. There's credible evidence that the Postal Service, has been manipulated essentially to slow the mail, if not completely prevent the delivery of ballots, but then to prevent them from being delivered timely so that they could help play into a narrative to question the outcome of the election. So there's just, every day we get up, unfortunately, and we hear about some new technique that we never even imagined.
In your sense, I mean, on balance, I mean, where do we stand today with respect to those who are trying to protect the right to vote versus those who are trying to suppress it? You've won some cases, obviously, that you've talked about, and others are pending. And there are some cases that have been lost. I mean, the Voting Rights Act, for example. But on balance, where do you think things stand right now?
Well, we've got more holes in the sail than we ever have. But if we have a strong enough wind, we're still going to be pushed forward. Everything we're seeing here in the last, few months is that the turnout is like never been seen in my lifetime. I think I just saw before I came on here today that nearly half of the 2016 vote in several southern states has already turned out and secured their ballots. So, these things only work vote dilution is its own item, but vote denial only works at close elections. And if we do, in fact, have a, overwhelming number of people, and, I was listening to Lorrie's comments just now, and it's interesting to hear their science behind it, because my own feeling from just watching this is people in a lot of places is, oh, you don't want me to vote? Well, we'll see about that. And you see that all over the place right now. And it'll be very fitting if that's what ultimately does end this latest wave. But the final thing I'll just say is this. The notion that we're ever, on Natalie's point, as the Supreme Court decided that we're in this post-racial period, we will never be in a place where we don't need a law that protects everybody's right to vote, especially prohibits discrimination on race and ethnicity. So hopefully this wind we've got right now will finally push that into a place where even courts can't mess with it later.
So you actually anticipated, Chad, where I wanted to go next. The whole idea of voter turnout this go round, and the signs that seem to be pointing toward historic levels of turnout. Given that, as you pointed out, that a lot of these voter suppression techniques depend upon elections being close, what's sort of your impression right now of how likely these things are to be successful, given the engagement that voters seem to have? And let me start with Lorrie, since she brought up that point about suppressing the vote as sort of as motivation for people to mobilize.
Sure. I mean, I'll just reiterate and then turn it over to hear from some other folks. But I'm a broken record in every space like this. I'm saying cast your ballot early if you're going to mail in. If you're going to stand online for early voting, make sure you bring a couple of different meals and some good folks with you that will want to stand with you and keep you good company, and a well-charged cell phone. But I make light of those things. But on the other hand, it's very heavy for many voters right now, because they're standing online thinking about, am I 6 feet apart? How is my mask on my nose? Is everything okay with this entire process? So they're balancing so many different things as they seek to be a part of the democratic process during a pandemic, oftentimes with voting for their communities and for themselves, but also because they want to see change based on the last 6 to 8 months and things that they've experienced in their own lives. So it's consequential in ways that we could have never imagined this time, even last year. And so I just want to take full advantage of letting folks know that casting that ballot early, checking up on it, making sure that you help folks to fill out their mail-in ballot, particularly if they are an elder or elderly populations, or even young folks new to the political process. You don't have to be a political scientist at UCLA or a voting rights expert like Chad to help your neighbor right now, today, figure out how to get this done and get it done the proper way. So I just want to encourage everyone that you can serve a role, and you can set up Zoom meetings. A lot of folks are doing that with their community-based organizations, or you can also join a text banking if you don't feel comfortable canvassing. So there's so many different other ways that you could follow up with us to figure out how you might become a part of the political process.
Yeah, I like that. Some practical actions we can take to be a part of the solution. Matt, your thoughts?
Well, one of the things I think, as we're watching this this surge in voter participation right now, most states started earlier than they did in 2016. So in many places, it would only be about right now, 2 weeks before the election, that really things were getting underway. Most states started, weeks earlier. Is don't get complacent in that that could be people who would have ordinarily voted 2 weeks early or a week early. And so we are expecting a big number of votes. And we're also expecting a big number of people to try to opt out of election day voting on November 3rd. So these numbers that we're seeing, while they're very encouraging, they're also expected. And that means that, no side is necessarily ahead right now. It's just that some folks are voting earlier, while other folks are likely going to wait till election day. And so don't get complacent in this, and continue to push your community and people to get out the vote. And just ask people, how are they going to vote? Do they need assistance? Do they understand the voting rules in their community? Here in California, we're very fortunate that you can not only, every voter got a ballot sent to us, we can send it back, we can get text message updates, we can track it, and they tell us when the ballot is received. All of our friends and family across the country aren't in that space. So I would just call on people to say, reach out to some folks, maybe in particular people who aren't as politically aware, who maybe don't watch the news and follow all the updates, and check in with them and make sure that they're getting their ballots in so that their voice can be counted. And we had 135 million votes cast in 2016. And let's try to shoot for like 150 million, a huge number across this country of voters making their voice counted.
That'd be an amazing turnout. Natalie, your thoughts?
I first want to reiterate Matt's point about how we individuals, and I think, especially for all of our students listening, you guys are taking classes, you understand what your rights are, sharing with your family and friends, right? How to vote if there's a problem. I just got a call from my dad, who's apparently his vote wasn't counted, so then I had to help him figure out how he can get another ballot. So this is the things that we can do for our families. My true closing point that I wanted to make is that, when we talk about elections, there's always this attention about, kind of vote choice, candidate choice, or swing states, so it's, or swing voters, so it's all about like, oh, if they voted for Obama in 8 or in 12, are they going to vote for Trump in 16? So we're always talking about this one super voter that goes back and forth. But really, if you actually, I want to offer a different interpretation of the outcome. If you actually look at voting records, right, and voting analysis from 8, 12, and then for 16, really what determined the election was the candidate that was able to turn out more voters. This is less about changing minds and more about getting communities to turn out to vote. Barack Obama was able to turn out new African-American and voters of color. You can argue that Donald Trump was able to turn out certain areas in rural America and other specific parts of the country that then felt really energized and voted for him. And so at the end of the day, this is really how we are empowered in this country, because your vote really does matter. This is really about turnout.
All right. Chad, any final thoughts from you about what we can do in the final 2 weeks to kind of ensure that we have the best turnout we can have and that everyone's vote is counted?
My number one thing that I try to tell people is we have to respect all votes, period. So I have strong feelings about how I think this election ought to turn out, and I'm sure each of the rest of us do, and many of our observers do. But we can't just value our votes and not value theirs. That's the slippery slope that gets us to where we are now. Everybody's vote counts. period, full stop. And the more we communicate that to our neighbors as part of our social fabric, you know, telling the truth, taking care of family, doing right by my neighbors, every vote counts. The more that's part of our public fabric, the better off we'll all be as Americans.
All right, appreciate that. Well, I'd like to thank you all for your experience, your insights, the thoughts you have about where we are in 2020 and what we need to do to ensure that our election and our democracy is sound and we adhere to the ideals that I think we all believe in. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us tonight. And I hope that you gained a lot of insight and that you can take some of the suggestions that our panelists have offered and get engaged yourself. You know, it goes without saying that, of course, we hope that you all vote. I did. So I encourage you, as a number of our panelists have said, to vote if you haven't done so already, and to encourage everyone you know to do the same. So thank you, everyone. Remain safe, and we'll look for you at our next salon. Take care.